Starfield is not Skyrim in space. They truly gave themselves a tremendous challenge. The scope of Starfield is truly impressive. The gunplay is excellent, but this grandeur came at a cost. Its core gameplay loop completely strips away the main appeal of Bethesda title. A backdrop that feels as though it's brimming with endless possibilities becomes forgettable because of its lack of depth. What Bethesda tried to achieve with Starfield is admirable. Despite what the critics say, Starfield is not Skyrim in space. Every aspect of its formula diverges quite heavily from the Fallout Elder Scrolls dogma. And I want you guys to keep this in mind when I dismantle much of Starfield's core gameplay loop and design choices. For I believe that the many very ambitious experiments launched by Todd Howard and his team imploded before takeoff and will be very difficult to correct. You see, Starfield's core issues are apparent from its opening hours. You begin your journey on a small mining colony where, after a period of shooting rocks, you are tasked by your boss to collect a mysterious substance. After touching the substance and experiencing a vivid acid trip, you are introduced to the central mystery of the main story, the artifacts. Shortly after this introduction, the mining colony is attacked by pirates, and you are tasked with transporting this substance to the headquarters of the organization who commissioned the search, Constellation. Now, many have talked about the problems of the set piece when compared to other Bethesda titles. It just lacks the drama and grandeur of the dragon attack in Skyrim, the thrill of the Emperor's assassination in Oblivion, nor the strange charm of the Bethesda and Obsidian Fallouts. But my issue with the intro is not its content, but where it leads the player. You see, being tasked with the artifact and given access to interstellar travel through Barrett's ship could have been the impetus for a grand introduction to space that would have kick-started a broader journey of exploration. But instead, what actually happens when you enter your ship for the first time and go to the navigation console? You're sent to a loading screen. For me, this gets at the fundamental problem with Starfield. Its core gameplay loop completely strips away the main appeal of Bethesda titles, exploration. Because there is nothing interesting about the specific map marker of New Atlantis, or Aquila, or Neon, or Paradiso, you'll never naturally drift into their direction. Instead, the player's exploration is dictated by missions, not personal whims and curiosity. But for me, the problem with Starfield's exploration is much bigger. It's not confined to the loading screen. The main problem with Starfield's exploration is the excessive scope of the map. If players were able to explore maps maybe a size of an eighth or a quarter of a standard Fallout or Elder Scrolls map and not lose the novelty of exploration not driven by quest markers, Starfield could turn into an interesting experience that also diverges from the standard one map model of Skyrim, Fallout, so on and so forth. But it doesn't try to achieve this balance. Most planets, even those that house the major settlements, may only contain one non-auto-generated area. Therefore, exploration is essentially pointless. When you travel to the planet that houses the game's most expansive settlement, New Atlantis, there is no reason to leave it and start exploring its flora and fauna or to search for new settlements. Because everything on that planet, even the main one, is entirely generic. Now, just to make it clear, I'm not saying that Starfield is a complete flop. I enjoyed it. Just like a pizza, if you take a few toppings off, it doesn't ruin the meal entirely. I'll go even further than that. I'll say that in many ways, Starfield even improved many parts of the classic Elder Scrolls and Fallout formula. The gunplay, first of all, is excellent. Whether they took some direction from id Software, the creators of Doom, or not, it's clear the gunplay represents a massive leap from the Fallout series. Moreover, as I mentioned before, the scope of Starfield is truly impressive. When I first went to New Atlantis, it blew my mind with its tremendous size. Remember, in 2015, this was a large Bethesda settlement. Now, Rivet City and Diamond City were cool and all, Right One, so on and so forth, but they just don't compare to the grandeur of New Atlantis, or Aquila, or Neon, and the various smaller settlements throughout. But this grandeur came at a cost. You see, Bethesda doesn't have unlimited resources and time. They had to make a decision about what features to prioritize and what to de-emphasize. And you can see this with a lack of interesting content in most of the settlements despite their immense size. Most of the cities are packed to the brim with shops and characters who pollute your inventory with decades of uninteresting fetch quests. And I mean decades. This overabundance of miscellaneous nonsense and lack of depth can, after first impressions, make these vast settlements seem remarkably small. When I entered Gagarin for the first time, I was excited. Snippets of convos with the corporate elite, city folk, and UC security gave me the impression of a highly interesting setup for a large-scale factional conflict. You see, Gagarin gave the impression of a city with a clear identity crisis at its boiling point. An angry but proud population suffered with de-industrialization following the war were increasingly at loggerheads with a greedy corporate elite who counterintuitively might offer a route for investment and do-gooders trying to keep the peace. But instead of the perfect setup for a great multiple faction quest, my introduction to Gagarin set up a fetch quest, a corporate fetch quest. Another quest centered around convincing shop owners to help Vanguard recruitment. This left me so disappointed that the next time I was brought there during Barrett's mission, I rushed straight past the settlement and into the lawyer's office. And for me, my experience in Gagarin exemplifies the core issues of the game. In Starfield, a backdrop that feels as though it's brimming with endless possibilities becomes forgettable because of its lack of depth, almost like a mirage in the desert. This is because, on the whole, quests that actually matter will just take you on fetch missions from A to B, and so your experience will train you to ignore large swathes of the map. It gets to the point where you'll struggle to remember a single name within Starfield's Colossus settlements, and yet Doc Mitchell, or Benny, or Sonny, or Tenpenny still come to mind more than a decade later. The sad thing about all of this is that Bethesda knew what they were going for. They consciously made this decision. It's ignorant to think that they would not have been more than aware of the success Obsidian had with the comparatively more condensed galaxy of the Outer Worlds. And they have a stellar record of creating some of the most long-lasting and distinctive RPGs in gaming history. But they chose scope. Not only did they choose scope over depth, they made it boring. Starfield settlements are just that. Boring. New Atlantis is a generic vision of a high-tech sci-fi future. Its shops resemble a remodeled Apple store. Neon is less eccentric, more condensed, and smaller scale than Night City. Aquila is just cowboys in space. Paradiso screams tacky, and despite supposedly being the playhouse of the elite, ends up looking more like an all-inclusive family resort. Now, I'm not saying that Starfield was a copy and paste exercise. Real thought was placed into many of the design choices. Starfield is full of interesting and truly innovative design, but is mostly confined to barren or abandoned planets. And so, in my view, does not add to a cohesive experience. And this leads me to something Bethesda did get right: the atmosphere of the planets. Now, I'm unsure why this is the case. It could be the often fantastic soundtrack feeling of being in vast, empty spaces, but once you're on the surface, planet exploration is almost a meditative experience, quite to the extent that Skyrim was, of course. No game, at least for me, has captured the pure sense of relaxation and escapism that Skyrim exemplified. Skyrim captured our attention so memorably that there was a channel solely dedicated to Skyrim vibes 12 years after its initial release. But Starfield does somewhat replicate this with a much more muted, grey colour palette, almost reminiscent of the Capital Wasteland from Fallout 3, but with a slightly ethereal touch and in space. So I hope if Starfield 2 is on the books, Bethesda learns from the many positives and negatives of the initial Starfield experiment and really focuses more on space itself and less on a rather generic sci-fi world-building obsession. And I just want to reiterate before the video ends, I'm not saying this to hate on Bethesda. They truly gave themselves a tremendous challenge and didn't try to take the easier way out by trying to create a Skyrim or Fallout in space. But, and this makes me sad to say, their execution just wasn't there.